Hi guys, Gary here from IAIA 2016 from Nagoya. This is post number 3. I'm just going to take some of the highlights from the last couple of sessions I've been to, and I'm going to try and pull it together into kind of a single thread for you. I'll start off with climate change and what that actually means. Post-Paris, there was agreement by 162 countries to do two things. One was to keep global temperature rise to below 2 degrees. Secondly, they committed to voluntary reductions. Problem is that when you do the math on the voluntary reduction, which is all very terrific, that will lead to a 3.5 degree rise in temperature. So what happens is that as you can probably tell, the commitments don't match the aim. The good news, I suppose, is that they've also committed to doing reviews every 5 years. And my sense is that as time goes on, countries will do more and more and more about this kind of stuff. Okay, so what does it mean for EIA? And I will get to this, and I'm just going to take a bit of a sidetrack. One thing is very clear to me, and we get a very distorted view of EIA in WA, because most of our EIA is about the resource sector and that kind of thing. Worldwide, by far the most majority of EIAs are done on major projects which are about infrastructure, primarily things like roads and rail and things like hydro dams, that kind of thing. And I guess perhaps the way I teach it as well is to emphasise that, because I use WA examples, but just to get your head around the fact that worldwide it is primarily about infrastructure. And I wanted that now, therefore, go back to climate change and the role of EIA. And this is what I try to link to. There are three things about EIA and climate change. One is when you assess a project, can you build into that, particularly if it's energy intense, can you build into that considerations of climate change about mitigation? So can you make mitigation of CO2 emissions in particular, can you make that a scoping factor? Worldwide, everyone's struggling with this because people see it unfair that you deal with these things on a case-by-case basis. And that's the argument for things like emissions trading schemes, where you deal with it through that way, not through case-by-case assessments. Having said that, we're seeing that some projects are having CO2 mitigation built in. I think the most obvious example in WA is the Gorgon project, where they were required to geosequester the CO2 which was already trapped in the gas. The other issue is one of climate change adaptation. I will deal with this in the lecture, but again, this is being harder and harder to build in, because in effect, with EIA, you deal with the impacts of the proposal, whereas planning for climate change adaptation, the project itself doesn't require to consider that, because it's not an impact of the proposal. What you're dealing with perhaps is, if you're looking at major residential development and the impacts of that, should you also integrate within that considerations of adapting to climate change? But I will cover that in more detail in the lecture. Now, but the most important thing, I guess, is we're seeing more and more is getting back to this infrastructure, that to achieve our 2 degree target rise, minimising, we're going to have to spend around about $90 trillion on alternate energy infrastructure. And if you look at those dollar figures, that's going to be primarily two things, well, maybe three things. Primarily, it's going to be, particularly in developing countries, it's going to be hydro, and then in more developed countries and even developing countries too, but wind farms and also solar farms as well. And so what we're going to see is a shift in EIA assessing proposals which are aimed at mitigating climate change, so major hydro dams and wind farms, which is kind of interesting. And I guess we've already discussed, I think in the first couple of lectures, I gave some examples of hydro dams, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. just to reiterate the issues about the environmental impacts are pretty clear about creating a reservoir upstream and denying downstream water flows and what impacts that might have. But clearly the most important thing actually is on social impacts, particularly on communities that will otherwise live in an area on a riverbank where there's going to be a large reservoir now, and so on, and the reliance on the ecosystem services that provides. So that's that. But what we're seeing more and more is, particularly with wind farms now, is that there are growing concerns about the impacts of wind farms. And the two most obvious ones that get discussed a lot, certainly in this conference, they are the landscape issues and how you deal with that. That's highly subjective. Um, but the most significant one is bird strikes and how you deal with that. And it is a big factor in assessing wind farms. Generally speaking, they don't quantify what the impact should be. In other words, they don't set out there should be no less than 100 bird deaths every year. That's a very tricky thing to do because it's so unpredictable. And what do you do if you hit your 100 and you're halfway through the year because of an unusual event that occurred? For example, a flock of birds flew into that. Are you then required to close a wind farm down for the rest of the year? So no one's going this quantitative route. And so what they're saying is more that you need to prepare mitigation measures, in other words, to minimise the risk. And there was a guy who had a stall in this conference, and I might try and get hold of him tomorrow and interview him. But it's really interesting that now the technology that's going on, he's devised a system of using radar to help in identifying this. And this is primarily to do with migratory birds. So what they do is they set up a radar system around wind farms, and they're looking for, obviously for flocks of birds. And what happens is that if the radar picks up a flock of birds, they have spotters who then go out and say, is this a flock of birds and is it heading this way? If the answer is yes, they then use a software program to predict which of the wind generators are most likely to be impacted. They then monitor it, and then they can then close the generator down within about 15 seconds. And so if it gets close, they can then close that down. So that becomes one of the mitigation measures. And I asked the question about, well, that's fine about migratory birds, but what about local birds? These aren't, generally speaking, they don't go in flocks, they're just random birds. And the answer is that all the data actually says that with local birds that don't migrate, they actually very quickly learn to live with the wind farms, and you rarely get bird strikes with local birds after the first maybe 6 to 12 months of operation. So they kind of learn to live with it and know how to avoid it. Okay, so that was kind of some of the highlights that came out of the climate change and I guess the more infrastructure stuff that's going on. So I'll leave this post here at that, and then next post I'll talk about some of the other issues that we talked about as well. Hope you're having a good week off, guys.